Hello, everyone, and welcome to Healthy at Work. My name is Catherine Wilcox, a workplace health specialist with a big passion for helping people thrive at work. From the home office to the corporate office, from the assembly line to the front line, I've got you covered here for your healthiest life at work. Now let's dive into today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healthy at Work. I'm your host, Catherine, and this week on Healthy at Work, we're going to be talking about conflict and polarization in the workplace. So, if you are in the workplace and you're noticing that conflict seems really quick to escalate, it's becoming more personal, it's becoming more difficult to navigate, you're certainly not alone. These are things that I can say from my vantage point. I'm noticing a lot in my own practice and really wanted to tuck into this topic this week with someone whom I know does a lot of work in this space, and I'm really excited to be joined by. So I will just take a moment here to introduce my special guest this week, Cherolyn Knapp. So, Cherolyn is a seasoned conflict resolution practitioner, civil mediator, workplace investigator, and lawyer based in Victoria, BC. From 2004 to 2019, she built a robust civil litigation career, providing strategic advice and advocacy for individuals, businesses, and organizations across a broad spectrum of civil, commercial, employment, and human rights disputes. Her practice included appearances before various levels of courts and tribunals, a strong record of out of court resolutions, and a leadership role as co managing partner of a thriving law firm. Since 2019, Cherolyn focuses her practice on the neutral role. She leverages her deep understanding of legal disputes to help parties find constructive paths forward, often engaging in restorative practices. Frequently engaged as a mediator and facilitator for litigants, employees, and professionals embroiled in conflict. Cherolyn also conducts comprehensive workplace investigations and assessments across public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and in unionized and non-unionized environments as well. A sought after dynamic speaker, she shares her conflict resolution expertise, processes, and skills for navigating high conflict behavior. Cherolyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, always a pleasure to speak with you and learn from you, Cherolyn. Really glad that you're here this week. And the work that you do is really needed in the world in 2026. And so I'm wondering, as somebody that works very extensively in the conflict resolution space, what you can share about the ways that polarization is showing up in your work. And maybe even if you wanted to start by sharing, like, what is polarization for those that might not be using that term specifically to describe what they're experiencing and noticing right now?
Sure. I'll say a little bit about what polarization is, and then I'll actually tell a little story to illustrate what I mean. But I think if what we can think about is, magnetic poles or poles on the earth, of when people become so far apart that they're seeing thing in an either or, in a black or white, and they're very, very far apart in terms of how they see things. I might add that although we think, gosh, things are getting much more polarized, it seems, I don't know if it's new, to be very honest. I was reflecting, preparing for this conversation and thinking back, through the entire 20th century, a lot of very polarized and polarizing things happened geopolitically, there were a couple of world wars, some other major conflicts and wars throughout the world. And atomic bombs were dropped. There was in North America, there was a civil rights movement and a number of rights movements that involved, in some cases, resistance and a lot of effort and very opposing views. So I I wonder if what's new is the immediacy that we see things, right? Our immediate um, reception of not only legacy media, which can report on and show us pictures of things. I mean, that existed throughout the 20th century, but information directly from people who are right there. And so whether that's in a war zone or a conflict zone throughout the world, or whether that's in our armchairs on our phones commenting on things that we see, or whether it's people in workplaces and organizations. Um, I think there's an immediacy because of social media and our ready access to technology that means things can become escalated very quickly. The story I wanted to tell is thinking about an organization that I was involved in where conflict had escalated quite badly, and people had really lost trust in each other, and they needed the work that they were doing was first responder work, and they really needed to trust each other because of the danger of that work. And I have to say, actually, this kind of dynamic, I've seen it happen in multiple organizations I've been involved in. But in the one in particular I'm thinking about, um, someone, I talked to the people individually about what they were going through. And someone told me a story, and they said, I consider myself to be kind of a neutral person in this whole thing. Like, I don't really consider myself to be in one of these camps that has formed over this contentious thing that's happening. But they were seen talking to the new person in leadership in the hallway in the building, and they were approached by someone afterwards to say, what were you doing talking to them? And the person's like, well, it was an operational question. I was just talking about the work. And the answer was, well, you shouldn't be talking to them. If you're not with us, you're against us. And that was an actual quote. And I thought, okay, so that really illustrates what's happening when there's polarization. And so the kind of dynamics that have been researched by various psychologists and social scientists reveal a couple of key features. So one is that when polarization happens, we're not just disagreeing, like we're not just talking about disagreeing about things. What we're talking about is seeing the opponents or the other side as fundamentally untrustworthy and even threat. And so that's an important key marker to see that, like, the level of threat that I perceive from the person or people on the other side is that they're actually out to get me. A second feature is that often I, I I've seen this in large group dynamics. I'm thinking about a large workplace that I worked with, which was in an industrial sector and a unionized environment. And oh gosh, there were just some really, really difficult things happening in that workplace. And what I used to talk to them about is to think about the whole group of hundreds of people on a bell curve. Okay. So you've got your leading edge people who are vocal about wanting to make change. You've got your trailing edge people who are vocal about resisting change or vocal about really wanting things to stay the way they used to be, saying things that the leading edge people find problematic. And then the majority of people are in the bell of the curve, right? They're in the middle, and a lot of them are staying silent. A lot of them really are very uncomfortable with what's happening and may just go with where the strongest wind is blowing at the moment. So there's that piece where a vocal minority can in fact really influence a group dynamic. Um, and another piece that I want to highlight, and then I'll stop here, is that um, understanding that what the research says is that when things become polarized, so thinking politically, there have been some interesting research in the United States around how Democrats and people who identify as Democrats and Republicans see each other. And they really, the research will show that they really see each other as morally bankrupt. Morally bankrupt. And the perception is that actually those people are out to destroy my way of life. But it's really similar. Both groups perceive each other the same way. I also see that in my own work, whether I'm in a room, maybe working with a union executive around their own collaborative skills, or in a room with HR or human resources or labor relations or leadership around their approach. And in fact, that same mistrust that the other side is out to get us is very common. What the research is showing is that what is motivating both groups is in fact feelings of vulnerability and fear that the other person is going to take something away from us. And so then we become more reactive and defensive. Whereas it's not it it's not aggression for aggression's sake. It's worry and fear and distress about losing something that ends up motivating the behaviors you get from both sides. So that was a long answer to your question around what I'm seeing, but hopefully that gives a flavor of what I'm seeing in my work.
That's such important context, Cherolyn. I love some of the points you made around there, around vulnerability, fear. Sometimes when, I think about polarization, you mentioned aggression, right? We think about, why are things so polarized or, how did we get into this place? And so, that what's underneath that I find really interesting. It's a more interesting question to explore, in terms of what drives people to feel like they need to armor up in this particular way. And so when we look a bit more deeply underneath that, there's sort of this sense of fear, vulnerability, like what is it that is truly being threatened? I find that such an interesting question to kind of pose. So
Yeah, and I think if you put that to a lot of people who are embroiled in a very polarized situation, they might also say something like, "Oh, well, that might be the case for other people, but in my case, in fact, I am under threat."
Mhm.
Um, that doesn't apply to me. Those people really are aggressive to me. They're not motivated by fears or worries or risk of losing something. And so I think we've got some real blinders on in terms of what we see and how we're able to digest it when we're facing that kind of behavior from other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find it so fascinating just thinking about how people's nervous systems respond in conflict, right? And when we're under threat, like that rigidity in thinking, can be activated as almost like a survival response. It's like I have to protect myself because this is unsafe. And I know we're gonna, dive into this in our conversation today. Just talking about how we can kind of navigate
Mhm.
that. And so maybe let's turn our attention to that. You've set the stage for us in terms of like what polarization is and how it can show up in workplaces. And you've provided some really tangible examples too, right, of comments or types of thinking that, can unfold. So, I know we were in planning for this episode talking a bit about, well, what what helps us, when it comes to kind of navigating through these dynamics. And one thing that were talking about was the practice of listening and deep listening specifically. And so I would love, to hear your perspective on, what is deep listening and how it might be able to help us address some of these dynamics of polarization and conflict.
There's some very interesting research happening by a number of researchers on the issue of political polarization and also dynamics between people, whether that's in organizations and workplaces, and what do we have that helps, what's available to us that helps to bridge divides, and what doesn't seem to work. And so some of the people that are doing this type of work include Guy Ichikoff at University of Haifa, Israel, Kurt Gray, a psychologist at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, um, and Peter Coleman, a psychologist at Columbia University. And so these researchers are doing lab work, doing research themselves, and authoring papers and books about these topics. So it's very interesting to dig into some of this work. What comes out of that um, is this idea that deep or highly effective listening helps bridge divides, which is a bit of it's like, really? I have to sit and listen to that? And what it's acknowledging is that um, it's a bit of a paradox, first of all. So if listeners maybe think about something that was very highly important to them, but where others didn't seem to be getting it, and they attempted to persuade or convince that, like, my way of seeing things or my way of viewing this is the right way, especially maybe on a polarizing issue, like a very sensitive topic. An example is we all came through some very sensitive conversations through the COVID-19 pandemic around things like vaccination and mask wearing and some very difficult interactions and polarization. So just by way of example. And so if you try to persuade the other person that marshal all your arguments and all your rationale about why you're right, is it likely the other side's actually going to go, oh my gosh, well, thank you so much for enlightening me. I didn't realize those things. And oh my goodness, you're right, I'm wrong. Like, that doesn't happen, right? We, in fact, dig in our heels and resist being persuaded. So if we want to try to bring someone around to having a bit more of an open mind to another way of seeing things, what deep listening or highly effective listening offers is a way for defenses to in fact come down. So instead of listening to you for as long as it takes me to rehearse what I have to say in rebuttal of what you're saying, instead of that, if I instead ask follow-up questions like, huh, and just really sit with where the other person's at. Okay. So here's what I think you're saying. Tell me more about that. How did that come up for you the first time? Where did you first start thinking that way? Um, how does that, tell me more about what that's like for you. And engaging with people in that way allows for their social anxieties and their own defensiveness to calm down a little bit. And through their own talking, here's what the research seems to show, that they, in fact, will become less rigid. And, there's going to be more nuance that shows up in their way of seeing things. It's going to sound less definitive and less polarizing. And now we have space within which to talk. The second thing that happens is that person also becomes more receptive to when it's time for you to share your own perspective about things, because you've really dug in and leaned in and listened to understand where they're coming from. They're going to also be more open to hearing at least where you're coming from. So the idea there is that persuasion doesn't work, so don't bother. And if you want someone else to listen to you have to engage with where they're coming, as if it's rational and worth listening to, at least to understand it, not to agree with it, but at least to understand.
Yeah, and I love that point you just made, Cherolyn, because in my experience, I find people are afraid that empathy is agreement. Like that if I give
Yeah,
someone a platform or if I give them 5 minutes, to talk about, their position, that I'm somehow signaling that I'm comfortable with this, I'm okay with this, or that even that I agree. So there can be that fear in even creating that space for a
yeah.
conversation.
And it's troubling, isn't it? Because on the one hand, we want space to engage with people, but on the other hand, it's like, well, if I can't even tolerate listening to that. But I think if we separate ourselves from it and say, okay, well, I'm me and I get to have my thoughts, and you're you and you get to have your thoughts, and we're just going to engage. And I mean, to coin a term that gets used a lot, which is curiosity. um and I don't mean like weaponizing curiosity, like, well, I'm just curious, and then interrogating somebody, how could you think this? It's just like, but genuinely taking this open stance of like, so what's that like to be you? Oh, I see. I sort of see where this might come from. And whoever may be listening who thinks that, okay, but like objectively speaking, my way of seeing the world is the right way and somebody else's is the wrong way, like, just understand that actually each person comes from that perspective. Like, we all think we've got it figured out. So there's always something to hear from somebody else.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. So really, as you were talking too, I was thinking about the courage it takes, like to be the first person, right, in a conflict like that, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to show leadership here by showing curiosity, by creating space, to listen, and how brave, like what a act of courage that can almost be in today's world, to just step aside, right, from that need, that investment in being right, right, and being affirmed, and just to create that space to listen and be curious. Um, I'm wondering if we bring this, to the workplace specifically, Cherolyn, what leaders and employees can do, like how can this be supported in a workplace context, do you see? And I know you do a lot of work, across different sectors and industries. You've probably seen a lot. I'd love to hear, your experience, in terms of, bringing this into the workplace, how we can kind of support this practice of deep listening.
And I do, right? So I'll be working with leaders around setting the tone and setting the example for the change in dynamic that they wish to bring about. Sometimes the conflict involves some polarization between a team of people and their leader, or the leader's way of handling some polarization between various groups within, right? So you can end up with lots of disparate views. And so then what does the leader do? So the first thing is, I think, to be really cognizant of one's own nervous system and understanding that that kind of polarization and escalation is quite catchy. And so to just really work to stay quite grounded so that you can gain access to some of the skills that we're talking about. Leaders leaders can do very important work in beginning to shift a workplace dynamic by exhibiting and role modeling the behavior that they'd like to see. So so that involves really listening to understand, like it's a stance change, it's a mindset change. Like I'm actually listening to understand, not to rebut, not to respond, not to disagree with those disagreeable things that I'm hearing. So that looks like, getting grounded and calming the nervous system and not getting into conversations when one doesn't sort of feel like they're in a calm place, to make time for those conversations after they've had a chance to get grounded. And then in the conversation, it's as simple and complex as asking a question. Tell me more about that. I don't know if you have watched the streaming season The Bear on Disney Plus, but for anyone who may have watched, it's about a family restaurant and it's a workplace show really, but it's about a family restaurant and some very wound up characters who get into very tense interactions. And something that I really noticed is they can be, but they also care about each other. And they can be in the most intense conversation and they will look at it, the primary character, Carm, will look at somebody else and say, tell me more, tell me more. And so they'll keep saying, tell me more until they can get to the heart of what's going on. So even when it's the most difficult, I think it's a really good example of how stop yourself from speaking and attempting to persuade and just saying, say more, say more. So in a more professional, less fraught and nonfiction way, um, to really resist the urge to rebut and respond and jump in and to just really be like, huh, okay, tell me more about that. Tell me more about where that's coming from for you. And so that's a signal to others that and a role modeling of how we do things in this organization. I think there also needs to be skills development, right? Like we can have a policy. Many, and you know this, I know you know this from our previous personal interactions, but generally, many respectful workplace policies or bullying and harassment policies will say things like, we encourage everyone to have a conversation. Well, those conversations often don't work. Those conversations often end up defensive and make a situation worse and more highly polarized. And so let's equip people with skills for actually how do you identify what it is you want to talk about? Maybe not march into their workspace and say, we need to talk now. You need to listen to me. And instead have the skills to say, I'd like to explore this with you, and to really build skills and normalize around that. There's an example. I saw a Globe and Mail article in April 2026, which deals with some university seminars and workshops um, at University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and at University of Toronto, Victoria University, and what they are doing is creating opportunities for students to engage with each other on very sensitive topics. And these courses were developed out of concern around culture, around concern around, well, like you've said something offensive, and so therefore we need to shut that down and kick that person out. And so beginning to create some space and some skills for highly uh, deep and high quality listening, and really understanding these opposing views in order to start creating more space for understanding. So those are some things that leaders can do by practicing themselves and role modeling, developing skills for everyone, and then creating space for there to be conversations about difficult things.
I love that, Cherolyn. So, that idea of showing, and I think sometimes if people have that experience themselves of being deeply listened to, or somebody that was really just present, focused with you, that, can be a really powerful experience that helps you, understand the benefit as well. And, as you were sharing some of the practices of, grounding, knowing what's going on with your nervous system. And we're sharing just now too around, having these structured sessions, for high quality listening. The word safety really came to mind for me. And I know we're very aligned on that. A lot of the language sometimes we see in these general policies, right? I couldn't agree more that, often we're told, like, just go have a conversation. And yet, people may not have the skills. They may, really struggle with conflict, have a lot of avoidance around it. They might not feel supported. They might not feel prepared, and so how can we structure more safety, into these conversations? And sometimes people need to learn those skills. I know I certainly did. I love conflict and conflict resolution, but I was not skilled at it at all, in my early life. I had to really learn these skills for myself and learn to experience safety, right? In these, highly intense, exchanges and conversations. So I think it can be learned. I believe that really passionately as well. It's like we can learn to navigate difficult conversations. We can learn to listen in a new way. It just requires, right, that attention, that support. And I love how you signaled the importance of paying attention to our nervous systems as well, and being able to regulate and be prepared as well. So just on that note, I was just sharing a bit about safety, as you have as well. And I'm just wondering if there are times when deep listening could actually be harmful or is not recommended.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to be careful here because that, feeling of I don't feel safe right now, I don't feel psychologically safe, is often connected to the distress we feel when we feel unheard, we feel disrespected. Maybe we even feel that someone has discriminatory attitudes about us. So there are intersectional layers in there around what is going on connected to identity. So those things cause us often to feel quite unsafe. And when we're in an escalated threat response, we very much do feel unsafe. I think that needs to be distinguished from making a risk assessment around are there reasons to be concerned about safety of people? Has there, y- and it's nuanced, but have there been threats made that point to safety concerns that lets you know that maybe there's an abusive dynamic here, which is different than or on top of the threatened feelings that people are feeling. So a risk assessment is different than asking people how they feel. It's an assessment of the variables at play, and I think that's important. We're not going to put people into some kind of a facilitated dialogue where we just encourage them to listen to each other when are there is risk of abuse or um, risk of harm in that way. And I think another thing that we should be thinking about, a couple of other things to think about, power imbalances need to be addressed for these kinds of conversations to take place. And so that often means with the structured help of a facilitator, ensuring that there are mechanisms in place so that there can't be retaliation for having a difficult conversation, for not saying things in the most perfect way, for becoming upset, but to build in structures to address those. And I want to say that people who experience discrimination in their day-to-day existence really bristle at the idea that, they should be put into a mediation so that they are responsible for educating the other person on what they did wrong, right? And so that's not the kind of conversation that I'm suggesting, nor should you have to sit and listen to, why somebody else thinks they're right. It's and so sometimes that listening comes through a bit of a proxy, like a conflict resolution practitioner, right? That giving people the ability to feel quite heard does help lower the temperature, and then you can get on to how to resolve issues. So I'm not saying we never listen to people who are coming from a very challenging place. It's just that you might not put two people together for that. Um, and some people are incapable of any insight, right? Like some people, a minority of people, the way their personalities are, they just in a sort of have a pattern of seeing things as everybody else's fault and coming at things from a highly dysregulated place, and they really struggle to feel that sense of calm. And so I think we need some skills around understanding when we've got that kind of a pattern at play, and then maybe we're going to adjust our approach to those kinds of things where it's not about, because I think that highly effective or high quality or deep listening is around creating conditions for insight, and not everyone has a access to gain insight, and that's okay. There's different ways to engage with those people. So hopefully that answers your question, that there are times when we're not gonna just say, oh, I know what we need to do.
Mhm.
People need to listen to each other more. The final point here is that just listening is not a proxy for taking action, right? Leaders, in particular, leaders, yes, they need to do high quality listening to really hear what's bothering people. But then steps need to be taken to address those issues. And we can't, the listening part is a process response. Instead of debating, we're going to listen, but then we still need to take action to correct issues that are happening in our workplaces and organizations.
Yeah, so well spoken that, deep listening, is very impactful and helpful and useful and needs to be a bridge, to action. And so just on that note, Cherolyn, like, last question to you is, around some of those actions, some of the things that people listening and watching today, might, do to deepen their listening skills, or even some examples of, say you've engaged in deep listening, like what are some actions that could come next, after that
Hmm.
process has occurred.
From this conversation, what I'm hoping people take away and can maybe start practicing right away is one, that reframe, that if someone seems to be at the polar opposite way of seeing things as I do, to reframe that they're not necessarily coming from a place of aggression toward me, but they may in fact be fearful of losing something, and that could be the motivating behavior. It may not make the behavior okay, but that reframe helps us gain access to some compassion, which allows us to dial down a little bit and allows us to then ask open-ended questions like, "Oh, well, how did you get into that? When did that start for you?" And to not be so quick to be offended by what they say, but to just, be interested in their experience. So that's the first thing. Um, the second thing I think is if if a person notices themselves listening so that like preparing their response, right? Whatever you're saying, I'm just getting ready to say my thing back. Um, is that in Guy Ichakov's research, he suggests to name it and do a little bit of internal dialogue. Oh, look at that. There I go again. I'm actually listening to respond right now. I am practicing, and you just talk to yourself. Say, gee, Cherolyn, you're practicing listening to listen. We're listening to understand. So what could you do next? And so first of all, that reframe, and then secondly, that inner dialogue um, can really help to then change the mindset of like, oh yeah, yeah, right. I'm supposed to be listening to understand right now. What would the next best thing be that I could say to express uh, high quality or deep listening? And so the next thing to do is to ask a follow-up question. There's nothing like going to a party, being really nervous because you don't know many people, and you have the good fortune of sitting down with someone who's a good conversationalist. What makes that person a good conversationalist? Not all the talking they do. It's all the questions they ask you to be like, oh, and it might start easy, like, so been on any good trips lately? And then it's like, oh, and what did you think of? And what about this? And what about this? And so it's taking the opportunity to really engage with something someone said. And I picture it like it's like archaeology. It's just like digging out the layers to find out what's underneath. And sometimes there's some very interesting, surprising things underneath. So, and then the final suggestion that I have for people is to practice in lower stakes situations. Don't, pull out this nifty new skill for the very first time in your in your next very high stakes conversation. M- Maybe start doing it with your teenagers or your loved ones or your family members or someone at the grocery store, in the sense that you can practice having the words come out of your mouth in a way that sounds natural at a time when the stakes aren't so high, and then when the stakes are high, you've got some practice and some comfort level to do it naturally.
I love that. Yeah, just beginning, right? Beginning, not waiting, for the hardest conversation, the hardest thing, but just beginning and practicing. And, I just love that affirmation that, these are skills that can be learned, even if it's difficult, for you. There, with practice, we can learn to have these types of curious conversations with people. We can learn these skills. And you've given us lots of great examples of where to start with this, Sherilyn. And I could talk to you all day about this topic. I know we both love exploring conflict and listening. I would love to give you the opportunity to share with our listeners where they can learn more about the incredible work that you're doing.
Sure. So I have a website, which is nappresolutions.com. That's with my last name, KNAPP, resolutions.com. And it says a little bit about the different things that I do, and there's a way to get a hold of me there. I would also love for people, you're most welcome to follow me on LinkedIn, and I, post here and there about whether it's talks I'm giving or various topics that come up. So happy to have people connect with me either of those ways. And things that I love being reached out to for is we've got this really intense, complex situation happening in our organization, whether that's a big corporation or a small nonprofit or anywhere, a public sector employer or anywhere in between. Like we've got complicated things going on. How can we address this? sometimes that's through investigation processes, and I do that work, and sometimes it's through conflict resolution processes or restorative work, and I do those things as well. One thing I will do, I tell you, like in another life, I think I would go back to school and I would do graduate studies on all of these things. But I am instead doing work directly with people, and I'm not a scholar, but I like following a lot of scholars. So we'll make some show notes that have some links to some of the researchers that I've mentioned and some of the sources I go to for as I'm learning my own craft.
Amazing. Yes, we'll make sure in the show notes from today, we'll include all of the research that Cherolyn has shared with us in the show today, as well as how to get in touch with you as well, Cherolyn, to learn more and to help navigate, these, again, really complex situations that arise in our workplaces. Thank you so much for your generosity and being with us here today, Cherolyn. And thank you to everybody who has listened and watched. I'd like to encourage you, if you found value in this conversation today, to share it, to share it with your colleagues, your leaders, have some more conversations about this in our workplaces. Really important topic. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you back here next time. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and is not medical advice or mental health treatment. If you're struggling at work, please reach out to the supports within your workplace or community. This podcast was gratefully recorded on the unceded and ancestral homelands of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations.